Shalom, I'm Brother Yitzhak sharing with you another Scripture Nugget. Today's Scripture Nugget is from the book of Devarim, specifically chapter 28 and verse 1. We know that chapter 28 is a very important chapter to a lot of people, but what we're going to do is just look at verse 1, and we may get to verse 2 as well, but we're going to look at verse 1 because there's a key word here in verse 1. It is obey. And we're going to look at that and see what Yahuah is speaking to us out of his Devarim, out of his words regarding the word obedience, or rather obey. Obey. We know there's a lot of teachings out there concerning the calendar, and many people are trying to find the correct Shabbat or the correct calendar, whether it's a solar calendar, whether it's a lunar calendar, whether it's a mix of solar lunar, and on the flip side they would say lunar solar, and they're trying to go with whether it's a new moon, whether it's a dark moon, full moon, whether it's the first sighting of the moon. But let's stop the noise and remember that we all have to obey. We all have to obey. So let's look at chapter 28, verse 1, and look at obedience. And Devarim chapter 28, verse 1, it says, "And it shall be, if you diligently obey the voice of Yahuah, your Eloah, to guard to do all his commands, which I command you today, that Yahuah, your Eloah, shall set you high above all nations of the earth." Now we can just stop right here and look at the beginning of chapter 28. Again, a very well-known chapter, but he begins by saying obey. Not only obey, but if you diligently obey the voice of Yahuah. Now let's look at this word obey, and then we're going to look at what does it mean to guard, to do all his commands. Not some, but all his commands. So that word obey, it has a Hebrew number H8085, which is Shamah. Shamah. Now it has a primitive root word or root definition, and when you look at a primitive root definition of any word, when you go back to the Hebrew, you must pay attention to the first statement of the primitive root definition. It says, in this case, to hear intelligently. To hear intelligently. It is not to just respond and do, but it is to hear intelligently. There's a hearing that leads to doing, but then there's a hearing that is very intelligent. Look what it says. It continues by saying, it often with implication of attention. So when I hear intelligently, I'm paying attention. I'm paying attention. Now, what am I paying attention to? I'm paying attention not only to the words, to the command, but how the command connects to other commands. You see, Yahuah never works out of order. He works in order. He works in harmony with something that's already created by him, or something that he's already spoken. So I'm hearing intelligently, but at the same time, to hear intelligently, it is to pay attention. And when one pays attention, then one can follow or can walk in obedience correctly. And it's not just being obedient, but look at this next definition. It says causatively, it means what? To tell. Now, how can you tell? By obedience. You are telling by obedience when you act upon what is being spoken. When you act upon, when you carry out the actions, that's a sign of obedience. When you carry out the action, I'm actually becoming a doer of the Dabarim, or the doer of the word. Why? Because I have learned to hear intelligently. I'm paying attention to what Yahuah is saying. Now let's continue. In verse 2, because I am obeying, because I am hearing intelligently and paying attention, and because I am walking out and carrying out the things of Yahuah, or the words of Yahuah, he says in verse 2, all these barakah shall come upon you and overtake you. But it doesn't stop there. It's a contingency. What is the contingency? The contingency is if you obey. If you obey the voice of Yahuah, your Eloah. Look at this again. All these barakahs shall come upon you and overtake you if. That's a condition. You obey the voice of Yahuah, your Eloah. So obedience is a key. It's not because I'm Hebrew. It's not because I'm a Israelite. It's not because that I am a Torah keeper. It's not because I'm a truth seeker. It's not because you're a truth seeker. It's not because you're a Hebrew. It's not because you're a Torah keeper. It is because you obey the voice of Yahuah that the barakah overtake you. Now, on a side note, when you read the whole chapter of Devarim, chapter 28, you'll see the conditions of obedience and how when you walk in that obedience, you'll see that things begin to fall in place in your life. But it all hinges upon obedience. What is obedience? The intelligent hearing, the intelligent putting things together. Obedience, it means to tell. How can I tell? By my actions. I become a doer of the Devarim. Now let's continue. In this particular, in verse 2, he uses the word overtake. It has a Hebrew number 5381, which is nasag. Nasag. It means to reach. Remember, pay attention to the primitive root word. It is to reach, because every other definition from the primitive root word, everything that follows that connects back to the primitive root word. It means to reach. And when you think about reaching, you're thinking about an outstretched arm. You're thinking about when there's an outstretched arm, there is an ability, there's attainment, there's a grasp, there's a reaching, there's a removing, there's an action that takes place. He says, overtake, to reach, the ability to attain. Now, if you can think about in Shemot chapter 12, when you read the narrative of the Pesach, or Passover as it's commonly known, there is something that Yahuah said that is very profound. He commanded the destroying Melachim that when you see the blood, now the blood on the doorpost, the reason it was there is because of obedience. They had to obey. So when the destroying Melachim came, he looked for the evidence, or the sign to him was blood on the doorpost, the blood of the Lamb. Now, as he came and saw the blood of the Lamb on the doorpost, if you read verse 13, Shemot chapter 12, Exodus chapter 12, verse 13, you see that Yahuah made this statement. He made the statement, when I see the blood. Now, I know a lot of people claim the blood of the Lamb, which is good. A lot of people claim the sacrifice, which is okay. But the evidence that you are carrying out the command is that there was obedience to the Passover instructions. Without the obedience, there would be no shedding of blood. You had to obey. So when Yahuah says, when I see the blood, what Yahuah is seeing, he's seeing obedience. He's seeing obedience. Because without the blood on the doorpost, there would be no evidence, no sign of obedience. So keep that in mind. And so now let's get back to overtake. It is to reach, the ability to be able to attain. So he says, I will cause the barakah to come upon you and overtake you because you obey. Because you obey. So what is today's scripture nugget? The barakah shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of Yahuah, your Elohim, or your Eloah. To obey is to hear intelligently. It means to call to attention, obedience, and to tell. What is to tell? My actions or my carrying out the Devarim of Yahuah. Remember, claim the blood, but obey. Again, Yahuah says, when I see the blood on the doorpost. No, not when I see the blood. No, when I see the blood on the doorpost. When I see the blood on the doorpost, that's evidence of my obedience. Shalom, shalom. See you next time on Scripture Nugget.